Time to talk about one of the strongest units in all of 9th edition. Enter the melter rifle toting Eradicator squad. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're going to go over the Primaris Eradicators, now well established with their reputation to blow tanks into tiny little bits. In the video we're going to go over their datasheet and stat line, their damage output and weapon options, any obvious buffs and synergies on the table, and how I would use them in game. Let's get straight into it. So Eradicators are a heavy support choice for Codex Space Marines. They cost 40 points each, so a minimum squad of 3 of them will cost you 120 points base, and you can have up to 6 in a squad. Typically though, because of their total obliteration special rule, I think that Eradicators are almost uniquely suited to wanting to be in very small units, and there is some advantage to using their combat squad special rule to do so. Their stat line is pretty much the standard Gravis armor 1, movement 5 inches, weapon skill and ballistic skill 3+, strength 4, toughness 5, 3 wounds, 2 attacks, leadership 7 and a 3+ save. As per normal, the sergeant gets an additional attack and pip of leadership. Durability wise, they're really not too bad for the points that you pay. They're not super tanky, as you could get a heavy intercessor for 28 points for the exact same defensive profile. I'd really say the element that makes them most undercosted is their incredible damage output. Your basic issue 40-point Eradicator is armed with a melter rifle, a bolt pistol and frag and crack grenades, and their total obliteration rule massively amps up their damage output by allowing them to fire their weapons twice in the shooting phase if they fire everything at the same target and haven't advanced. I think almost all the time you will be trying to make use of this one, so essentially they're going to be firing each one of these heavy guns twice. The standard melter rifle is an Assault 1 melter gun with a 24-inch range, strength 8, AP-4, damage D6, and when they're within 12-inch range, they get D6 plus 2 damage instead of the standard D6. You can trade out those melter rifles for heavy melter rifles, which are heavy 1 weapons, strength 8 and AP-4 again, but they're base damage D6 plus 2 even if they're outside melter range, and if they happen to be within 12 inches, then they get D6 plus 4. Pretty ludicrous that if you roll hot with one of these, then you could potentially do 10 wounds with a single shot. We do appear to be getting back to the day where a single melter gun or 2 could really ruin a tank's day. Finally, you can pay extra points for one guy to be armed with a multi-melter instead of his melter rifle. This guy costs 10 points extra to include in the squad, so essentially your multi-melter marine is worth 50 points. With the new rules, he'll be getting 2 shots base, meaning that if you make use of total obliteration, that 150-point model will be firing a massive 4 shots at melter death. We'll take a better look at that damage output in just a second, but in terms of special rules, they have Angels of Death. Combat Doctrines won't actually help their ranged firepower output too much. They're already AP-4, so they won't care too much about that. Though I guess it could help out a tiny bit if they're in the Assault Doctrine in turn 5 or turn 6. Shock Assault can give them a little bit more close combat muscle, not that they really want to be there. And as we said, they have the Combat Squad special rule, which means that if you want to be fielding large amounts of Eradicators, taking units of 6 and then breaking them down into 2 units of 3 is really quite a good idea in my opinion, because it means that you're not just going to drastically overkill one target by firing all 12 melter shots into it. If you have 2 squads of 3 side by side, they can each choose to fire 6 melter shots at 2 different targets, which in general is going to be better. If a big 6-man squad is splitting fire, then it means that you're essentially going to be getting only 6 shots, the exact same amount as you would be getting if you just had a unit of 3 firing at the same target. Small squads are very much the order of the day for Eradicators. Finally, in terms of keyword, they are Primaris, allowing them access to certain stratagems such as transhuman physiology. They're Gravis armor marines, again with stratagems and transport implications. They're very helpfully a core unit, so they'll be getting all those nasty rerolls, and they are infantry for good interaction with terrain. Overall, Eradicators are a devastatingly powerful anti-heavy unit with pretty decent durability, spectacular damage output, though they're not without their weaknesses. They're short range, they aren't very fast, they're not great in close combat, and they're very underwhelming against any sort of horde. Let's talk about this crazy amount of damage that they can do then. First of all, just with the basic melter rifles, if they're firing against a toughness 7 vehicle with no buffs whatsoever, and they're outside melter range, they'll still do a whopping 9 wounds to that vehicle. Just a single round of shooting could allow a 120-point squad of Eradicators to really pay for itself in one go. Obviously this gets a fair bit better if you are within melter range. The melter rifles do also have the option of advancing and shooting, which isn't what you want to do obviously, due to losing total obliteration, but if it's the difference between hitting a hard target and not doing so, then it's still going to be worth it, and it could be kind of handy as white scars to have no penalty. The heavy melter rifles do have just a little bit more hitting power against vehicles, though being heavy weapons on infantry means that when you're moving and shooting you are going to lose accuracy. With their short range, I think it's going to be rare that you aren't needing to move, and there's other advantages to being able to move each turn, such as getting towards objectives or staying away from enemy threats. I feel like the heavy melter rifles are far more of a consideration for an army such as Ultramarines, with their doctrine to allow them to shoot as if stationary when they're in the tactical doctrine. A squad of 3 for 135 points would do an average 14.5 wounds to that toughness 7 vehicle, or still around about 11 wounds if they're on the move. Against hard targets, even on the move, they're still about the same damage efficiency as the melter rifles. Typically they'll be worse if they have to fire against infantry, just due to less shots hitting the targets, and point for point they have fairly similar damage output compared with the standard version. They only really get any better against heavies if you are managing to remain stationary or treating as if you're so, such as Ultramarines in the tactical doctrine. By paying the extra 5 points for gaining no more durability, it does mean that point for point the standard melter rifle version is a bit more durable too. Out of the two, I typically prefer to run the standard melter rifles, though I would run the heavy version in Ultramarines. Finally, we have the multi-melter, which to me seems like 10 points very well spent, again even better if you can fire on the move, such as Ultramarines. Even if we are assuming that multi-melter is going to be on the move, it has better per point damage than the melter rifle or the heavy melter rifle. So typically for me, for most chapters, my standard Eradicator squad would be 2 melter rifles and 1 multi-melter out of a squad of 3, for a very scary 8 shots, 4 of them from the multi-melter. So let's talk about buffs and synergies for them on the tabletop. In general, quite a few chapters have good combos for them, and most notable amongst them are of course those salamanders. Their doctrine giving them +1 to wound with those melter rifles is absolutely excellent, and it's just a straight flat damage dealing buff to the unit, but you also have characters such as Vulcan Hestan if you are playing actual core salamanders, the wounds roll reroll from their chapter tactic, and other very useful things such as their Crucible of Battle stratagem for just +1 to wounds. There's a reason that quite a lot of Salamanders players have been running these guys recently. In terms of other chapters, White Scars can advance and shoot them, though again that does cost you total obliteration, making them far less potent. Ultramarines we've already mentioned quite a lot, excellent for those heavy melter rifles. Iron Hands will give you the durability increase with their 6+ feel no pain, and also have quite a nice stratagem for 6s to wound causing extra wounds. Raven Guard or Stealthy can give them a bit of extra durability, plus Raven Guard could allow you to pay for Deep Strike for them for 1 command point each, allowing them to drop down exactly where needed, rather than jumping on at the edges of the board via Strategic Reserve. Imperial Fist could get a little bit of extra damage output from those heavy melter rifles perhaps, and to be honest, just on their raw stats alone, they're very solid in more assault orientated chapters such as Blood Angels and things. Just having a few really potent ranged threats to deal damage could be really handy within the army. In terms of characters, being core units they have plenty of options. Captains, lieutenants and chapter masters and chaplains can all give them extra damage increases in their own ways, and an ancient hanging around could allow them to use those shots and potential rerolls when they die. In terms of defensive buffs, having a librarian for Psychic Fortress for a 5+ invul would certainly help keep them safe, and Ironfather Phyros of the Iron Hands can do similar. Probably the most bang for your buck durability wise though comes from the Apothecary, allowing them to heal models, revive units, and also give them a 6+ feel no pain. They can be transported in repulsors if you want to, though I don't think it's worth it personally to include a repulsor in the army just literally to transport stuff about. I'd use it as more of an opportunistic thing if you have brought one along, then having a squad hide in there could be an interesting way for them to pop out onto the battlefield. Finally, they've got a fair few useful stratagems from the Core Codex Space Marines. Transhuman Physiology will cost you only 1 command point now when you use it on a unit that's 5 models or less, so I'd have a low threshold for using this when you're targeted by heavy weapons. Unyielding is the Gravis Armor one that gives you +1 to their saving throws when you're targeted by damage 1 weapons. I guess it could be handy if you're going to be absolutely drowned in damage 1 of fire, though typically it's not going to be the most efficient thing ever against 3 wound models. Steady Advance for 2 command points could allow them to fire heavy melter rifles as if stationary. Sometimes that might be worth it, though 2 CP is a little bit steep for me. And finally, the good old reliable Auspex scan could allow you to just nuke an enemy threat that materialises next to you. Out of all of these buffs, my favourite are Salamanders, potentially some character rerolls, the Apothecary for all of those healing buffs, and Transhuman Physiology, which is excellent value. So let's round up by having a quick chat about their in-game use. Firstly, when you're setting them up, I would strongly consider Strategic Reserve. You could keep 3 units of these back for just 2 command points due to their power level, and I'd say that this is an excellent way to deploy just a few small units of them. Obviously they like to get within 12 inches if possible, but they can easily just go at 24 and still be very efficient, popping up somewhere on the side of the board and dealing an enormous amount of damage to an enemy threat. I think it's rarely going to be a wrong choice for a Space Marine army to include a couple of squads of these guys in Strategic Reserve. Against a lot of armies, they'll just make their points back the turn that they come on. If you are deploying on the board, you could either think about trying to keep them out of line of sight or in cover turn 1, with a bit of a mind to where they're going to move to and what targets they're going to have in range. Ideally you want to be sort of close to an enemy vehicle, so deploying them late in the deployment phase might be a good idea so you can counter where the enemies put their tanks. You could certainly get a bit of a castle on the go, with a bunch of characters and rerolls and maybe an apothecary for the 6+ feel no pain, making a very hefty and effective damage dealing core to your army while you have other units fan out to secure objectives. But if you are doing something like this, I'd certainly want to be screening them from close combat. You don't want all those fancy melter guns with rerolls just locked up and made useless. I certainly wouldn't forget about advancing if it's going to make the difference between you getting range on a target that you actually want to shoot rather than double tapping it into some infantry traff. Then I very much would do so. There's no point wasting melter guns on things that don't need them. And I would typically shoot the unit fairly early in the shooting phase, as with big damage D6 weapons, they're really quite swingy. It could just destroy one unit then and there, or might fail spectacularly. I'd shoot them first and then have other units clear up. When the opponent's attacking back, transhuman physiology seems like excellent value to me. And I wouldn't forget that they do have at least some melee threat if it's needed. If you think that they're just going to get effortlessly killed next turn, then maybe just charging in to deal some damage to some chaff or tying up some enemy infantry units could actually be a reasonable idea. Could be particularly useful if they can fall back and shoot. Again, Ultramarines could be solid for that. In terms of comparisons, to be honest, very few units can match their firepower against hard targets in 40k at the moment, and I believe that for that role they're one of the most competitive units in the game. They certainly can be countered, and they can be fairly underwhelming if your opponent doesn't have any hard targets that they can reach, but as part of a greater, more balanced force, I think that they're going to be an excellent inclusion. I think that typically Eradicators will do a lot better than multi-melter Devastators in most circumstances. Just being able to fire those 2 melter shots on the move at no penalty is really quite helpful. One potential competitor could be attack bikes, weirdly enough. 2 attack bikes is 110 points, a little bit less durable, and only packs 4 melter shots rather than the 6 that you get for 120 with the Eradicators. But they do get the bolter shots, and they're very, very fast, being able to zoom all over the board and get in range easier. I'm not sure they're quite as strong as Eradicators, but they're certainly a different flavour of achieving the same goal. So let me know if your Eradicators have been living up to the hype down in the comments below. Have they just been blasting tanks off the board, or has their range been a bit of a problem? If there's any other combos, synergies or things that I've missed, then also let me know as well. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see some more Space Marine content on the channel, feel free to subscribe. We do have videos coming out pretty much every day on Auspex tactics. And if you've been enjoying all the videos recently, I'd just like to mention that the channel does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Channel patrons get a few perks, including being able to see new videos early, regular votes and polls to see what sort of things happen next on Auspex Tactics, and entry to the channel's regular monthly prize draw, where we post out some big kits to some lucky winners. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then feel free to take a look at the link down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.